Hey everyone, I'm Benjamin, and welcome to my book club. Since I mentioned that I read Warhammer and people have been noticing the Warhammer shelf down here, the most frequent question regarding that has been, where do I start reading Warhammer? And it's a really good question. There are hundreds of Warhammer books on Black Library, and it can be really hard to figure out what a good entry point to the series is. The universe is just so vast and full that writers don't seem to have any lack of things to write about. So come with me on this journey. I'm going to go through some of my favourites. Just like any sci-fi setting, the Warhammer books have their ups and downs. A lot of downs in the hundreds of books, but a lot of ups as well. And what they do better than other series I've read really is, it's in the name, it's war. It's that like sort of brutality of war. They're not super deep thinking books regularly. They're often action-packed, sci-fi, pulpy, action movie stories. They all deal with super soldiers and spaceships and aliens and monsters and demons and fights and spaceship fights and war and guns and tanks. And they're just really some of the most fun books I've read. And I'm sure if you've been interested in the past, you've Googled for Warhammer reading lists and you've seen charts like this, and they've probably scared you off, which is fair. But stick with me, it's not all as bad as that, and I'm going to help you get started with just a few of my favourite books that I think are great entry points into the universe. First off, one of the most often recommended books as a starting point, often recognised as a great entry point into the universe thanks to its human-level story, fantastic character writing, and the ability of the author to give you exposition without front-loading it all in just paragraphs and paragraphs of world-building. The Eisenhorn trilogy by Dan Abnett stands as a set of books that really can stand on its own apart from the universe. If you don't care about Warhammer, if you don't care about the universe it's set in, these books still serve as really good pulpy detective stories that are set in a sci-fi universe. Following our main character, Inquisitor Gregor Eisenhorn, he's sort of a super soldier, super spy detective whose job is to hunt down, aliens and heretics and demons that might threaten the Imperium of Man. Investigating threats both within and without the Imperium, Gregor Eisenhorn's put together a really fantastic crew of human-level viewpoints, of human viewpoint characters that we see the story through. And as a whole, the crew stand kind of outside the Imperium proper, thanks to the Inquisitor's authority above people. They're often seen as somewhat of an outsider, which, as outsiders as the reader, means that our viewpoint we can kind of relate to somewhat. And as the crew discovers things, we discover them along with them. And it's just a really fantastic view into the workings of the Imperium of Man. There aren't a lot of big space marines or big space fights in these series. They're more detective stories. They're more political intrigue. There is action and it's great when it happens, but it's not the focus of the series. And it really gives a good breakdown and understanding of all the background political machinations and political intrigue and all the factions within the Imperium that other books might gloss over a little bit, assuming you already know. The Eisenhorn books stand out from a lot of the books in the Warhammer series as just really fun, good detective stories that stand on their own as a sci-fi book. If you have no knowledge of the setting, then this is a great entry point, and if you find yourself interested in these characters going forward, Dan Abnett reprises a lot of them in some of his follow-up books. Up next, also by Dan Abnett, you're going to hear his name a lot. The man is just prolific. And if Dan Abnett's name is stamped on a book, you can be pretty sure the book's going to be a real banger. Up next, though, is the Gaunt's Ghost series, a long-running series and a fantastic entry point to the series. It follows the titular Gaunt, Ibram Gaunt, as he leads an army of just regular human soldiers. The Imperial Guard are the Imperium's regular soldiers, as opposed to the Space Marines, who are their super soldiers. And this book follows one group of these soldiers through a conflict that lasts many years. A fantastic ensemble piece. The Gaunt's Ghost series really focus on lots of different characters from within this regiment of Imperial Guard. And it gives a great insight into the regular day-to-day lives of the foot soldiers of the Imperium. Humans that can often be seen as kind of cannon fodder or background soldiers in a lot of the books focusing on Space Marines. We explore a lot of the regimental rivalries and actions between the factions of the Imperial Guard that show a lot of depth and human emotion in these soldiers. It's this political intrigue and leadership struggles and infighting between the different factions within the Guard that give us a really great running through-point storyline and some really great viewpoint characters and how they react to these things. But it's interspersed with some of the best ground combat that I've ever read in any sci-fi, really. A lot of them read like they're just straight out of World War II, recaps of campaigns. They're visceral, they're realistic, and they're emotional, and I love this series, and I really think you might too. Alright, up next is the introduction to probably Warhammer's most iconic faction, the Space Marines. The genetic super soldiers of immense power who can turn the tides of war simply by being there can be kind of hard to relate to in a lot of novels, but Dan Abnett, once again, comes to the rescue with his collection, Brothers of the Snake. A collection of short stories culminating in a novella at the end. We follow the point of view of a single Space Marine from the start of his career through to the end. And Brothers of the Snake gives us a fantastic insight into the mind of a Space Marine. We really see how they think, how they operate, how they fight, and how the universe as a whole reacts to them. It sheds a great light on their role within the Imperium. Too often, Space Marines can be seen as ubiquitous to the setting, purely because they're the main characters normally. But in reality, in the universe, Space Marines are exceptionally rare. A regular soldier will probably go his entire life without even fighting on the same planet as a Space Marine, let alone seeing one. And Brothers of the Snake does a great job of showing just how thinly stretched Space Marines are. The need for them far outweighs the number of Space Marines that exist. And you see that tension captured in this book of there's always somewhere else the Space Marine could and should possibly be, and how they think about that and how they react to that. Brothers of the Snake also gives us a great insight into the inner workings of this Space Marine chapter, the Iron Snakes, as this mysterious, almost elusive chapter who's very rarely written about outside of Dan Abnett books. It's great to see the inner workings of any Space Marine chapter. They're all somewhat similar, so moving forward into other books, you'll be able to have a good reference point to some of the concepts and thoughts that might be going on with the Space Marine characters in other books. Alright, that's some of the books about the good guys. What about the bad guys? The Chaos Space Marines are the Imperium's most ancient and terrifying enemy, and I have two suggestions for books that are based on them. Firstly, we finally have a book that's not by Dan Abnett. I'm going to suggest Storm of Iron by Graham McNeill, featuring the Iron Warriors, these cold, calculating Chaos Space Marines. They are the masters of siegecraft and fortification, and we follow them through a campaign where they lay siege to one of the Imperium's great planetary fortresses. As with a lot of the great Warhammer books, one of the biggest strengths of this book is that we see things from both sides of the conflict. We have human viewpoint characters, which gives us an instantly relatable viewpoint into the universe, and these characters in this fortress under siege, we see the terror and brutality of facing off against these Chaos Space Marines. The dread and tension that these characters are feeling and that their situation evokes in me just sits in my gut and builds with each page dripping with dread, as I just kind of know the inevitable outcome of this, and you just see the characters fighting against this hopelessness. And it just builds page on page on page until it just feels like there's a stone sitting in my gut. Then we get to see from the attacking side, from the fantastic characters on the Chaos Space Marine side. We see the ambition, the cold, calculating brutality, the willingness to do anything to achieve victory, be that in this siege or in leadership struggles or in faction conflicts between the Chaos Space Marines. We see what the powers of chaos and the powers of the warp have done to these creatures that could once have possibly been called semi-human and are now just monsters. It is the best example in Warhammer I can think of humans facing off against Chaos Space Marines and the emotion that can evoke. I also love a siege story, and I love being able to see it from both sides here, and the tension and the action scenes are fantastic. My next suggestion got number 9 in my top 10 sci-fi novels this year, and it's the Night Lords trilogy by Dempski-Bowdan. Our main character in this one is Talon of the Night Lords, the legion of Chaos Space Marines most focused on fear and terror acts. They use fear and almost terrorism as their weapons in this war against the Imperium. Cut off from supplies, little hope of reinforcement, this group of Chaos Space Marines travel the stars on their spaceship, wreaking havoc where they can, fighting in this 10,000-year war that they've been fighting, hoping to somehow succeed and may perhaps redeem themselves. All the characters in this book are so brilliantly written. They all have their different ambitions and reasons for fighting. And it's great as we follow them through these raid actions and scavenging actions to gather supplies. Their armor is so old and degraded by this point, they're forced to replace bits and pieces of it with stuff scavenged from their enemies. It's a great book to show the mindset of some of these Chaos Space Marines, some of which have been around since the original war that split them off from the Imperium. And this book deals heavily with leadership conflicts, not only from within Talon's own squad for his position, but the worries of the leader of the spaceship, of Talon, who's this growing in popularity and respect, taking over his position. And we get to see these different levels of leadership, conflicts and squabbles of factions within the Legion that make this really interesting and make it a really interesting character piece. Aaron Dempski-Bowdan has written in this book the most psychotic, deranged, villainous main characters that I think I've ever read, and somehow they still come off as empathetic and sympathetic. I still root for them. I still celebrate with them in victory and commiserate with them in defeats. I find myself thinking of, well, what good points they're making, and then one of them will flay a slave or something, and you'll be like, oh wait, no, that's right, these are the bad guys, and they are the bad guys. Full of scary, evil space marines and scary, evil demons. The Night Lords trilogy is full of really fantastic combat action scenes, it's full of really great spaceship combat scenes, and it's full of really well-written characters from start to finish. And I think it's probably the best insight into the mind of the antagonists of the setting. And it's a really good entry point if you're interested in this more evil sort of side of things. Something a bit lighter now, and something I might not pronounce correctly. The Caiaphas Cain series by Sandy Mitchell is another long-running series focusing on the Imperial Guard. Unlike Gaunt's Ghosts, however, the Caiaphas Cain series is hilarious. Following our main character, Caiaphas Cain, he is a commissar in charge of another regiment of these Imperial Guard, and we follow him through basically a whole campaign over the course of his career, as the books are written as though he was the author and these are his memoirs. We see in his words a character who has grown to become a hero of the Imperium, who doesn't believe he deserves it, who thinks he's mostly just a bumbling, always too lucky fool. But we also have other characters providing maybe some more context in the form of footnotes and forwards and inserted little pieces that might show that maybe Caiaphas is actually a hero and he's just too humble to write that he's a hero. So we end up with equal parts like heartwarming, light-hearted comedy, equal parts action, adventure, war, equal parts unreliable narrator, and it ends up with just some fantastic stories that go through and give really good introductions to a lot of the factions in the setting. Caiaphas Cain and his soldiers end up butting up against most of the different alien races that the Imperium is fighting, as well as a lot of the chaos and warp beasts that they're up against as well. Providing a really good insight into a lot of these groups and factions and aliens, because not only do we have Caiaphas's first-hand accounts, we also have the footnotes and some research pieces that get interspersed within that give us a bit more background context. If you're looking for something a bit more lighthearted and a bit more fun in the Warhammer universe, these are the books. Alright, one last book by Dan Abnett. If you've been watching, like I was, the Masters of the Air series on Apple TV, then this book, Double Eagle by Dan Abnett, might be for you. Reading almost like a recount of a campaign that the Air Force might have taken part in World War II, it doesn't read that dissimilar to Masters of the Air, the book the show is based on. We follow in Double Eagle a group of pilots, of bombers and fighters, as they have to hold off this Chaos Ground Force and the Chaos Air Force as the Chaos groups advance towards these civilized sections of the planet. And it's up to the Air Force alone to try and hold this force back until the Imperial Guard can arrive to reinforce these cities and towns to protect the civilians. Dan Abnett, again, just writes some fantastic characters, including some of the best supporting characters that I can think of in a Warhammer book. We follow the bomber pilots and the fighter pilots through the entire campaign, and these supporting characters that are around them really give a sense of urgency to their actions. We see the bomber pilots on sorties bombing targets of high value. We see fighter pilots in high-octane dogfighting, probably the best fighter pilot dogfighting I've read in a book. And we see the soldiers on leave and at rest at the base, and we see them interacting with the civilians that they're protecting. We see the conflict that the tension of this situation causes within the characters and within the civilians and surrounding military personnel. And we see the fantastic war machines that these planes are, and they're explained in such fantastic detail, they almost become characters unto themselves. Really believable, for me at least. This campaign is written fantastically. You can feel the ebbs and flows, the pushes and pulls of the front lines as the pilots do their best against this unrelenting inevitability, just trying to buy those extra hours, those extra days, maybe that extra week, so that the Imperial Guard can come and protect the civilians and the Air Force. Just before the last book, I will just let you know that if you want to pick up any of the books I've been talking about, I do have Amazon affiliate links in the description below, where you can pick these up and help support the channel just a little bit. Unfortunately, a lot of these books are only really available in ebook right now, as Black Library has been terrible in the past 4 to 5 years of keeping things in stock, and the second-hand market prices are just ludicrous. Finally, the Forges of Mars series by Graham McNeill shines a light on these enigmatic tech priests of Mars that you might have heard about. These red-robed men and women who have decided that to eschew the weakness of flesh in favour of the strength and the power of machinery and technology, replacing many bits of their body with machines and technology and metal prosthetics. We really get an insight into these characters in this book that we haven't previously in a lot of Warhammer books, and we see the inner workings of their religious worship of technology and of the Omnisire, the machine god that they worship. And we see how different they are from the rest of the Imperium, their own factions, their own governments, their own ways of doing things, and their own dogma of this religion that just drips off every page of this book. Forges of Mars explore every level of society within this setting, from the high-up captains of the ship that we're on, all the way through down to the slaves that are cleaning the engine bays, that are performing brutal back-breaking labour because it's easier and less abhorrent to the religion than creating new technology to perform these tasks. Set upon a giant Mechanicus Ark ship, almost a world unto itself, this many-kilometre-long, huge, sprawling, ancient warp vessel, Forges of Mars is almost a microcosm of the 40k setting at large. Aboard this ship, as it travels outside of known space, we have the Tech Priests of Mars, but we also have other factions that are taking part in this campaign. We have a group of Space Marines. We have a group of Imperial Guard regiments. We have a group of the weird mechanical soldiers of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Skitarii legions. And we have a group of the Titanic war machines, the God Machine Titans, these many-story high walking robots that are on board the ship as well to take part in these actions. And these groups all come together to head outside of known Imperial space, trying to track down a lost expedition that had leaked news that it might have found technology of massive import, of great need for the Imperium, but also of great religious import to the Adeptus Mechanicus. And throughout their mission, we come across a lot of the antagonists that we see elsewhere in the 40k universe, making this a really good micro inspection, I think, of all the factions both within and without the Imperium, and giving a really nice breadth and a perhaps not the most traditional entry point to the series, definitely a suitable one that's going to be quite a bit of fun. And there you have it. That's my 9 recommendations. And if you read, a handful of these, or find a good, nice series in here you like and you finish it, you're going to be introduced to almost all the main factions and players and alien races that are present in the galaxy. And from there, you're set up to kind of follow the main rule of Warhammer reading. No one's expected to read every Warhammer book that comes out. That's ridiculous. The main rule really is you find a group, a chapter of Space Marines you like, an alien race you think is cool, a character you like, and you just read about that. You just find the next book about that you can find. And then, maybe you run out of stuff from there, but by then you'll probably have grown interested in a different group of Space Marines or a different group of aliens, and then you can follow those. Or you'll start to hear hints of big events that have happened, and you'll hunt down those books. You'll hear about the destruction of Cadia and be like, oh, what happened there? And go hunt down the books to do with that. Reading Warhammer has been a favourite pastime of mine for years now. When I'm not in the mood for the world-changing ideas of authors like Philip K. Dick and Arthur C. Clarke, I love that there's always a book sitting on my shelf full of big space marines and spaceship battles and big guns and edge-of-your-seat action that I can be almost guaranteed is going to be entertaining without being too taxing. Thank you so much for watching to the end, everyone. If you've read any of these, I'd love to hear in the comments what you thought of them. Do you think they would have been a good entry point to the series? And if they weren't your entry point to the Warhammer series, what was? What was the first Warhammer book you read? And how do you think that prepped you for the rest of the universe? Also, I'd love to hear if you have any other suggestions for entry points into the series. Let me know in the comments and I'll reply and we can talk about why I might not have picked it. Chances are I might just not have read it. There are hundreds of books. If you want to hear about any other Warhammer books, if you're a Warhammer reader or you're interested, I'm going to have some reviews coming up soon. I'm reading a few Warhammer books lately. And if you hit the subscribe and hit that bell icon, you'll be notified when those new videos come out. And if you want to check out my other reviews, the playlist should be right here. That'll have all my sci-fi, horror and fantasy book reviews in them. And if you could leave a like on the video if you enjoyed it, I'd really appreciate it. But most of all, the most important thing you can do is just remember to keep reading.